Here's a tip on how to make your own vines. Just pull apart some sisal cord and give that a bath in Mod Podge, paint and water. Next, twist the strands together to your desired thickness and leave them somewhere to dry. You can also dump them in individually if you don't want to make a hot mess like I did. Once dry, they still remain a little flexible, so they're very easy to bend around and glue in place on the diorama. Seal everything with a mix of PVA glue, water and isopropyl alcohol, and then sprinkle on any scale leaves that you might like for this. I bought these, but I do have a tutorial on my channel on how to make tiny leaves from coffee filters. Seal it one final time and your tiny vines are done. If you like this video, the full build is on my channel.